Boston in winter had a way of biting straight through your coat, your gloves, your bones, even your hope. Jamal Bennett knew that chill better than most. He'd been driving rideshare full-time for nearly 3 years now, ever since the factory downsized and the union dissolved. Nights like this, when the air crackled with frost and the streets were slick with the salt of last week's snowstorm, were the hardest. But bills didn't wait. Rent didn't care if your fingers ached from gripping the wheel. And his daughter Maya, she was the reason he kept showing up, night after night, mile after mile. It was 11:47 p.m. when the request pinged his phone. South Station pickup, headed to Cambridge. Jamal accepted, glancing at the passenger's name, Elijah C. Nothing unusual, until he pulled up to the terminal. A teenage boy stood beneath a flickering streetlight, hugging a duffel bag so tightly it looked like it held his whole world. He wore a thrift store coat 2 sizes too big, and his sneakers, black, frayed, soaked, were definitely not meant for Boston winters. A stack of papers peeked out from a folder he clutched to his chest. Jamal rolled the window down. "You Elijah?" The boy nodded, his breath puffing in the cold. "Yeah. You Jamal?" "That's me. Hop in." Elijah slid into the back seat, shivering. Jamal cranked up the heat. "Where to?" he asked, glancing at the address. "Harvard admissions?" "Yeah," he said, his voice thin. "Interviews at 8 a.m. Jamal frowned. "You planning to sleep there or something?" Elijah hesitated, then laughed awkwardly. Yeah, kinda. There's a bench nearby. I figured I'd wait it out." "You're serious?" "I couldn't afford a hotel. Spent everything on the bus ticket up from Atlanta. My mom took double shifts to help me get here." Jamal's hands tightened around the wheel. He'd been poor, but not sleeping on a park bench before your Harvard interview poor. He took a breath, then turned on his blinker, not toward Cambridge, but toward home. "What are you doing?" Elijah asked. "You're not sleeping on no damn bench tonight, not while I've got a warm couch and leftover chili." "But," "No buts. It's freezing out. I got a teenage daughter, so I know how kids eat. Come crash for a few hours, then I'll drive you to Harvard in the morning. Deal?" Elijah was quiet for a long moment. Then he nodded. "Deal." The apartment smelled like cinnamon and onions. Maya had baked something earlier, and Jamal's chili still lingered from dinner. Elijah looked out of place in the warm kitchen, like someone who'd stumbled into the wrong story. Maya, in her pajamas and fuzzy socks, stared at their guest. "Who's this?" she asked. "Elijah," Jamal said, setting a bowl of reheated chili on the table. "He's crashing for the night. Got a big day tomorrow." Maya raised her eyebrow, but said nothing more. She poured Elijah a glass of juice and slid it across the counter. "You allergic to peanuts?" "No." "Good. There's cookies on the stove." Elijah smiled shyly. "Thanks." Later, after Jamal had given him a spare blanket and an old hoodie, they sat in the living room with the TV on mute. "You really think you can get in?" Jamal asked. Elijah shrugged. "I don't know. My grades are good, top of the class. I work part-time and volunteer at a free clinic. I wrote an essay about my grandma. She died when I was 10. Couldn't afford her medication. That's why I want to be a doctor." Jamal nodded slowly. "That's a hell of a reason." "I just want to do something that matters," Elijah said. "Even if it's just helping one person live a little longer." Jamal didn't sleep much that night. He kept thinking about the boy on the bench, the miles he must have traveled, the odds stacked against him. He thought about Maya, too, and what kind of world she'd inherit if kids like Elijah didn't get their shot. At 7 a.m., Jamal made scrambled eggs and toast. At 7:30, he drove Elijah to the interview. Before the boy got out, he turned back. "Thank you, Mr. Bennett, for everything. You kill it in there, and when you get in, make sure you help the next kid behind you. That's the deal." Elijah nodded, then stepped out into the cold toward the wrought iron gates of Harvard University. Jamal watched until he disappeared behind the brick arches, then drove away. He figured that was the last he'd ever see of the kid. He had no idea. This ride would be the beginning of something neither of them could imagine.
Jamal's apartment sat on the third floor of a tired brick building in Roxbury. It wasn't much, but it had heat that worked most of the time, neighbors who minded their business, and a crooked little balcony that caught the morning sun. More importantly, it held every memory that Jamal and Maya had built together since his divorce 5 years ago. Birthday balloons still taped to walls, Maya's middle school trophies, a photo of her mom still tucked inside the cabinet. But after Elijah left that morning, the apartment somehow felt different. It wasn't just that Jamal had let a stranger sleep on his couch, it was the feeling that something bigger had walked through his door. Like he'd opened more than his home, like he'd opened a door to something waiting for him. He tried to shake it off. Bills needed paying, Maya had basketball practice after school, and the check engine light on his Toyota had started blinking again. Great. But that evening, when Jamal came home and dropped his keys into the ceramic bowl by the door, Maya was already waiting for him, arms crossed. That kid, Elijah, you think he's going to make it? He's got fire. That goes a long way. I Googled him, she said, pulling out her phone. Found an article from his high school. Valedictorian, debate team captain, science fair winner. Kid's a machine. He smiled. Told you. But there was something else, she added quietly, tapping her screen. His mom passed away 2 months ago. Cancer. She was a nurse. Jamal froze. No wonder the kid looked like he was carrying a storm. Maya set her phone down. Why'd you help him, Dad? Jamal sank into the couch, rubbing his temples. Because someone once helped me. When I didn't have gas money to make it to a job interview, a stranger filled my tank. No questions asked. Maya sat beside him. So, you're paying it forward? No, I'm passing it on. There's a difference. That night, while Maya slept and the TV murmured to itself in the background, Jamal wandered the apartment like he was seeing it through someone else's eyes. The cracked tile by the fridge, the paint peeling near the windowsill, the table with one leg shorter than the others. And yet, it was home. A home where kindness had happened. A home with 2 stories now, the one they lived in and the one they just added. He walked to the balcony, stepping into the cold night air, looking over the city lights. Somewhere out there, Elijah was sleeping too, maybe in a dorm, maybe on a couch like this one, maybe still unsure if the world would ever meet him halfway. Jamal whispered a quiet prayer for the boy. Then, as snowflakes started to fall like promises, he stepped back inside. He didn't know that in just a few short weeks, Elijah's story would collide with theirs again. Not quietly, not privately, but with headlines, cameras, and a helicopter loud enough to shake the sky. It began the way big things often do, quietly. Jamal was wiping down the windshield of his car at 6:30 a.m. The frost clung like second skin, and the morning air held the bite of a Boston winter tightening its grip. His breath misted the air as he moved with the practiced rhythm of a man used to working before the world truly woke up. Then he heard it, a lone mechanical hum. Not a plane, not traffic. He looked up. A helicopter. At first he squinted into the early morning haze, shielding his eyes against the pale dawn light. It was black, sleek, not a news chopper, not a medical airlift. It hovered, then began to descend, not to a hospital rooftop or helipad, but into the parking lot of his apartment complex. A few others stepped outside, drawn by the sound. Mr. Henry from 2B leaned out in his bathrobe. Mrs. Rivera clutched her little dog in disbelief. "What the hell?" someone muttered. Jamal took a cautious step forward, the wind from the blades kicking up loose gravel and bits of litter. The roar pressed into his chest like thunder in reverse. And then, a door opened. Out stepped a young man in a sharp gray coat, a tailored scarf blowing in the downwash. Clean-cut, calm, familiar. Elijah? Jamal blinked, stunned. But it was him. 18 years older, taller,
confident in a way no longer borrowed but fully earned. The skinny boy with uncertain eyes was now a man who looked like he belonged on magazine covers or running a company. Jamal didn't move, couldn't, until Elijah started walking toward him, smiling. "Mr. Hart," he said, the sound of it almost lost in the fading chop of the blades. "I told myself if I ever made it, I'd come back the way only people who dreamed big enough could." Jamal stared, stunned. You flew here?" Elijah laughed. "Well, I figured I owed you a ride." Jamal finally smiled, shaking his head, trying to hide the tears forming. By now, neighbors were recording on their phones. Maya had stepped out too, speechless, phone in hand, her eyes wide as Elijah walked over and hugged her like a brother. "This is insane," she whispered. Elijah turned to the small crowd now gathering. "I hope I'm not interrupting your morning coffee," he said loudly. "But this man," he pointed at Jamal, "once changed my life with a couch, a meal, and a ride." Jamal put a hand over his mouth. "I've just signed a multi-million-dollar education initiative, and I'm starting it with the place I call my origin. I want to rebuild this neighborhood, sponsor local kids, and name a scholarship after the man who saw me before the world ever did." He looked at Jamal again. "The Jamal Hart Opportunity Fund. Sound okay?" Jamal couldn't speak, could barely breathe. The sound in the sky had settled, but inside Jamal's chest, something was just beginning to soar.
The helicopter had long since disappeared, taking with it the last gusts of cold air that had stirred the block. But the moment it left, something quieter remained. The hum of wonder in the hallway, the buzz of whispered conversations, the turning point of a neighborhood that had just witnessed the impossible. Back upstairs, in apartment 4C, 8-year-old Amari Daniels sat beside the window, her knees drawn up to her chest. She hadn't gone down with the others. She never did. The world outside her window was both too loud and too far. But this time, something had made her pause mid-coloring, lift the curtain, and press her cheek to the glass. She had seen it all. The helicopter, the man in the gray coat, the hug, the speech, and Mr. Jamal, their grumpy but kind building handyman, standing like a hero in a storybook. Amari blinked slowly. Her mother was asleep in the next room after another long night shift. The apartment was quiet, the refrigerator humming softly like a lullaby that never stopped. But Amari's mind wasn't still. For as long as she could remember, she'd watched people leave, never come back. People talked about dreams, about change, but always from a distance. She'd seen opportunities drive by in black cars, wearing suits that didn't know her name. But this was different. This was hope with landing gear. Later that afternoon, Jamal returned upstairs with grocery bags in hand. The man had refused to take the elevator since 2009. On the third-floor landing, he paused and looked at her door, 4C. He hadn't spoken to Amari much over the years. She was quiet, reserved, one of those kids you worry about but don't want to frighten by caring too loudly. He knocked gently. After a moment, the door opened. Amari peeked through the gap, half hiding behind the doorframe. "Hey there," Jamal said, softening his voice. "Are you okay?" She nodded. I saw you at the window. I thought I'd stop by and drop off some cookies. Store-bought, so don't get too excited." She cracked a smile, barely. "Was that a movie?" she asked. Jamal smiled. "No, baby, that was real life." Amari blinked slowly again. "Will you be on TV?" He chuckled. "I hope not." She looked down, fingers fidgeting with the hem of her oversized hoodie. Then she whispered, "He said you helped him when he was a kid." "Yeah, long time ago. He didn't have much, but he had a spark. I just tried to keep the wind off it." Amari tilted her head. "Could you help someone else like that?" Jamal looked at her. She didn't ask the question as a child would,
full of fantasy. She asked it like someone needing to know for herself, like someone measuring how far kindness could reach. "I'd like to. Why? You got someone in mind?" She paused. "Maybe." For a long moment, neither of them spoke. Then Amari reached out, took the cookies, and said, "Thank you." Jamal smiled. "Anytime." As the door gently closed, he stood there for a beat longer, then made his way back down the stairs. But in his chest, something new had settled. Something smaller than a scholarship, quieter than a helicopter, but maybe, just maybe, more powerful. Because behind that window, a little girl had seen hope descend from the sky and believed for the first time that it might one day knock on her door, too.
The news crews had come and gone, leaving behind streaks of tire marks in the slush and microphones full of sound bites. By morning, local TV stations were airing clips of the helicopter landing in Jamal's neighborhood, overlaying triumphant music and bold headlines. From orphan to Harvard donor, a black man's full-circle moment. Helicopter philanthropy, a gift 18 years in the making. They captured Jamal's brief, reluctant smile as he stood beside the two grown siblings he once fed on a freezing night. The camera zoomed in on the moment Daniel handed him the letter, a full scholarship grant for low-income students in the city, bearing Jamal's name. They even managed to get a clear shot of the stunned neighbors clapping, crying, laughing, whispering. But for all their high-definition footage and dramatic cuts, the cameras missed everything that mattered most. They didn't see Jamal in the hours after everyone left, sitting at the small table in his one-bedroom apartment, the scholarship letter folded like a sacred relic between his fingers. He didn't move for almost an hour. The heater sputtered in the corner, but he didn't notice the cold. He was back in time, to the moment he met Daniel and Chloe. He had just gotten off a long shift working construction and was walking past the closed-down diner near 82nd. The snow was heavier that year, clinging to everything like sorrow. That's when he saw them. Two small silhouettes curled behind a dumpster, thin coats soaked through, the girl's arm wrapped around her brother. She wasn't crying. She was singing softly. He didn't hesitate. He offered food, took them to his own home, made sure they had socks, called the shelter only when the kids were asleep, just so they'd at least have a bed the next day. He thought about that moment often, not because he needed to feel good about himself, but because it reminded him of what didn't make the headlines, the quiet, unseen decisions that save lives. The cameras didn't capture Jamal slipping back into the neighborhood that evening and finding Mrs. Rowley, the elderly woman in 2D, who once lent Jamal a heater when his broke, and hugging her without words. She hadn't seen Chloe in 15 years. They didn't see Amari at her window again, not hiding this time, but waving as Jamal returned from a quiet walk around the block. She left a note taped to the hallway wall. It read, "You helped him. Maybe you can help more. I believe in you." The cameras certainly didn't catch Jamal taking that note and sliding it into the back of a dusty photo album, right beside an old, faded picture of him as a younger man, no smile, no dream, just tired eyes and a lunch pail. Later that week, when Daniel was interviewed by a national talk show host, they asked him the expected question, "What do you remember most about that night?" Daniel smiled, but his eyes looked far away. It wasn't the food. It was the way he didn't look at us like we were broken. The host paused, then moved on to the next question, perhaps not understanding the weight of that answer. But Jamal did. Because that, too, was something the camera didn't capture. And never could.
The new house wasn't extravagant. It didn't have marble floors or chandeliers, but it had light. Real, golden light that poured in through wide windows Jamal never dreamed he'd own. It had warmth in its walls, not just from insulation, but from intention. A home built not with money, but with meaning. The first dinner wasn't announced with any fanfare. There was no official guest list, no table cards or Instagrammable spread. It simply began when Daniel arrived with bags of groceries, Chloe carrying fresh-cut flowers from a sidewalk vendor, and Amari trailing behind with a notebook and a bottle of apple cider she'd bought with saved allowance. Jamal had spent the day cleaning, even though the house was spotless. He didn't know why. Maybe it was the nerves. Maybe it was the disbelief still curling around his ribs like steam, that this was his. This dining table, this stove, this roof. He set out plates, not matching, not fancy, but they were his. Chloe was the first to notice. "You kept it," she said, pointing to the little ceramic figurine sitting on the windowsill, an old salt shaker shaped like a rooster, one she'd once picked out at a yard sale when she was 9. Jamal had kept it all these years. He smiled. "Some things are worth holding on to." Daniel chuckled. "Even that ugly thing?" "Especially the ugly things," Jamal replied. "They remind you that beauty isn't the point. Memory is." The table filled slowly. Roasted chicken, green beans, mashed yams, rolls still warm from the oven. Jamal couldn't stop staring. Not at the food, but at the people. Jamal, now a man with his own tech startup and too many degrees to count. Chloe, soft-spoken but strong, running a non-profit for foster teens. And Amari, the girl who had once peeked through cracked doors and now sat confidently, head high, shoulders back. They talked. They laughed. They passed bowls back and forth like something sacred. At one point, Daniel raised his glass, non-alcoholic cider fizzing in the light. "To beginnings," he said. "To kindness," Chloe added. Amari raised hers a little higher. "To Jamal." He tried to wave it off, but they wouldn't let him. "Seriously," Daniel said, quieter now. "You didn't just feed us. You saw us. You gave us enough hope to make it through 100 nights." Jamal cleared his throat. "You would have made it anyway." "No," Chloe said. "We wouldn't have. We didn't need a hero. We needed someone who didn't pretend not to see." The room fell silent, not out of awkwardness, but reverence. And then, as if summoned by fate, the doorbell rang. Standing there was Mrs. Rowley, holding a foil-covered pan and wearing a shawl Jamal remembered helping her carry upstairs once during a blackout. "I heard there was a dinner happening," she smiled. Soon others followed. Neighbors, kids from the building, the mailman who had known Jamal since his 20s. The table grew longer. Chairs were pulled from closets. No one was turned away. By the time the night settled in, the house was humming, full of stories and laughter and music from an old speaker that sometimes crackled but never quit. Jamal stood back for a moment, watching it all unfold. He wasn't used to being the center of anything. But here, in this room, he wasn't a symbol or a story. He was home. What made the dinner unforgettable wasn't the food or the house, or even the guests. It was what Daniel whispered to him before leaving, as they stood beneath the porch light. "This isn't payback. This is a ripple. You threw a stone in the water 18 years ago. We're just riding the waves." Jamal nodded. The night air was cool, but not cold. Not anymore. Inside, Amari had already started clearing plates. The first dinner in the new house wasn't the end of a story. It was the beginning of a new one. Long after the last guest had left, and the final fork had been dried and placed back in the drawer, Jamal stood alone in the living room. The warmth of the evening still lingered, like the scent of roasted yams and laughter pressed into the walls. The hum of the city outside seemed softer tonight, more distant, as if the world had paused just long enough to let something sacred settle. He leaned against the doorframe, watching Amari on the couch. She had fallen asleep with a book resting on her chest, her face turned toward the window. The porch light lit her outline gently, and Jamal saw the same little girl he once watched chase pigeons in the park, the one who had tucked handwritten notes under his door, each one signed with a stick figure and a heart. He crossed the room slowly, careful not to wake her. There was something in the quiet that asked not to be broken. He covered her with a blanket, smoothing it out at the corners. She stirred only slightly. Then he moved to the window and looked out. The sky was velvet. The stars blinked without urgency. Somewhere,
a siren wailed faintly, but here, in this pocket of peace, time seemed suspended. And in that quiet, a promise began to take shape. Not the kind spoken aloud, not one drawn in contracts or etched in stone, but the kind made from soul to soul, formed in the steady drum of gratitude and the silent vow to never let what happened 18 years ago fade into the background. That night, Jamal remembered something old, an evening when he sat in a diner booth, eating his only warm meal of the day. A woman with tired eyes and a soft voice had paid for his food without a word. She was gone before he could thank her, but he never forgot. That was the first ripple. I owe a kindness, he had told himself. And tonight, seeing Amari in his home, knowing Daniel and Chloe are thriving, Jamal understood the kindness had not just returned, it had grown wings. He walked to the table and sat alone in the chair Chloe had occupied just hours earlier. There was a folded napkin still resting there, and when he opened it, he found Amari's handwriting. I'm going to write about you one day, but not as the man who helped me, as the man who taught me what help really means. Jamal's hands trembled slightly. He closed his eyes and breathed deeply. He thought of all the years between that snowy night and this one, the forgotten birthdays, the rented rooms, the empty Christmases. None of it seemed wasted now. Every hard moment had carved space for this, for people, for meaning, for home. Then he stood, turned off the light, and let the quiet hold him. The promise wasn't about doing something grand. It was about continuing to show up, to be present, to notice, to never pretend not to see. Outside, the city didn't know what had just happened in that small house. There were no headlines, no cameras, but in the quiet, Jamal smiled. Because sometimes the world doesn't need to witness a promise to be changed by it.
It started with a knock. Not loud, not urgent, just 3 firm taps on the front door that interrupted the peace of a Wednesday morning. Jamal looked up from his coffee, confused. He hadn't scheduled any meetings, no deliveries were expected, the neighborhood kids weren't due to mow the lawn until Saturday. Another knock followed, still polite, still patient. When he opened the door, the sight that greeted him made him blink. 2 men in neatly pressed suits stood on the porch. One held a leathered portfolio, the other had a microphone clipped to his lapel, and a small camera crew standing just behind the bushes. "Mr. Jamal Winters?" the man with the folder asked. Jamal's body stiffened slightly. "Yes." "I'm Elijah Ford, producer with Human Hands. It's a national docuseries. This is my colleague, Andrea, and the team behind us is our crew. May we speak with you for a moment?" Jamal hesitated. "What's this about?" Elijah's face softened. "It's about what you did 18 years ago, and what's happened since." Behind the camera, the boom mic operator gave a subtle nod. The crew was already filming. Jamal exhaled slowly. "Come in." By midday, the living room was filled with lights, cables, and the low murmur of professionals doing what they do. Jamal sat in his favorite armchair, hands folded, looking calm, but his heart raced. "I didn't do anything extraordinary," he told the camera. Andrea leaned forward. "Sir, you changed 3 lives forever, and now those 3 are changing the world." The footage the crew showed him was quiet and powerful. Daniel, now a young doctor working in underserved communities in Chicago, spoke directly to the camera. "She fed us that day not knowing who we were. That kindness stayed with me. It made me want to be someone's reason to survive." Then Chloe appeared, standing in a courtroom defending tenants against eviction. "I remember the cold of that winter more than anything, but I remember the warmth of her plate even more." And finally, Amari, sitting in a university library with books spread across a wide table. "I've studied 1,000 stories," she said, "but the one I carry in my blood is this.
A woman with calloused hands and a quiet voice fed two strangers like they were family. And Jamal, he made sure we never forgot where we came from. By the time the interview wrapped, the camera crew was silent. Jamal looked at them, a small smile on his face. "You came all this way for a story about a waitress and a dinner?" Elijah stood, his voice low. "We came for a story about Grace." The next morning, the phone wouldn't stop ringing. Producers from other networks, local radio stations, schools asking him to speak, old neighbors he hadn't heard from in years. But Jamal kept the same pace as always, steady, grounded. He answered some calls, ignored others. He didn't want fame. That weekend, someone knocked again. This time, it was the mayor. She came with a camera crew of her own and a plaque, in honor of quiet heroes and in memory of a woman whose kindness rippled beyond what even she could imagine. The city declared the day Grace Simmons Day. Jamal stood at the podium that afternoon and said only one thing. She never had much, but she gave what she had, and we're all better for it. That night, Jamal sat back down in the same armchair, the living room finally quiet again. On the mantel was a framed photo of Grace, the only one he had, taken the day they opened her old diner again for one last meal. She wore her apron, and her smile was tired but proud. Jamal looked up at her and whispered, "The world came knocking today, Grace, and I let them in." Outside, the wind picked up, but the house stayed warm.
It had been years since Amari had spoken about the diner in full. He could still smell the cinnamon that used to fill the air on Saturday mornings, still see Grace humming as she flipped pancakes with a rhythm only she understood. He remembered her hands, steady, weathered, warm. She was never in a hurry. Everything had intention, even the way she looked at him. But most of all, Amari remembered the first time he ever heard someone call him special. Not because he was smart, not because of any test score, not because he had survived. Grace had once crouched beside him when he spilled a glass of milk, tears of embarrassment stinging his eyes, and said, "You're special, Amari, because you get back up." Now, standing at the edge of a stage in front of thousands at a youth summit, that same voice echoed in his head. "You ready?" a coordinator asked, holding a mic toward him. Amari nodded. His speech wasn't rehearsed. He hadn't planned to tell his story, not fully. But as he looked out at the rows of young faces, many of them with his same skin, his same eyes, his same silence, he changed course. "When I was 7, I was homeless. My sister and I used to sleep in the back of a church basement when we could. We were cold, we were scared, and we were hungry." The room went quiet. One day, a woman fed us without asking anything in return. She fed us like we belonged there, like we mattered. That was the day I started to believe in tomorrow. He paused. She wasn't rich, she wasn't famous. She was just good. After the speech, kids lined up for photos. But one boy didn't approach. He stood to the side, hands in his hoodie pocket, eyes heavy with something unspoken. Amari walked over. "Hey," he said gently, "you good?" The boy shrugged. "Maybe." "What's your name?" "Micah." "How old are you?" 7. Amari blinked. Micah glanced up. "You really didn't have a home?" "I really didn't. But I had someone who made me feel like I did." "Do you think I'll ever have that?" "You will, and until you do, I'll be someone who believes you're worth it." Micah stared for a long second, then wrapped his arms around Amari's waist in a sudden hug. No words, just warmth. Amari held the boy close, eyes stinging, because he remembered every ache, every cold floor, every kindness. And because Grace was right, the boy who gets back up is the one who changes the world. That night, Amari walked alone under the city lights. He passed a bakery,
Inside, a woman was laughing with her daughter over spilled flour. He passed a couple arguing quietly, but with love in their voices. He passed a diner, empty now, but the sight of it pulled him in. The server was young, maybe 20, with tired eyes and a gentle voice. When she handed him his tea, she smiled and said, "You look like you've had a long day." He nodded, "One of the best." She tilted her head. "What do you do?" Amari looked at her, at the empty booths, at the jukebox in the corner. "I remind people that kindness is never wasted." She smiled. "We need more of that." He left a $100 tip.
The morning it broke, Jamal wasn't watching the news. He was in the backyard, tending to the tomato vines Grace had planted years ago. The soil smelled rich, like memory. He hummed an old gospel tune under his breath, the same one Grace used to sing when she cooked Sunday dinner. Inside, the phone began to ring. Once, then again, and again. Jamal wiped his hands and stepped into the house, just as the landline lit up for the 4th time. He answered. "Mr. Winters?" came a shaky voice. "This is Claire from Channel 9. We were hoping to get a statement." "A statement?" asked Jamal. There was a pause. You haven't seen it yet, have you?" "Seen what?" I'm so sorry. It's Dr. Daniel King. He was in Haiti for a medical mission. There was a mudslide near Jacmel. His team got caught in it." Jamal's heart dropped. The rest of her words blurred. Casualties, injured, missing. Daniel's name among them. By noon, the headline was everywhere. Doctor who rose from homelessness, missing in Haiti tragedy. Local hero believed to be among those lost. The man who healed so many. Now a nation holds its breath. Jamal sat in silence. Not from shock alone, but from a grief that didn't know where to land. Daniel wasn't his son, but he'd watched him grow. He'd watched him rebuild. Jamal had placed the first book in the boy's hands when he couldn't read. And now the thought of that boy being buried beneath foreign rubble tore something open inside him. Chloe called that evening. Her voice trembled. "I just spoke to the embassy. No confirmation. Just no answers." Jamal listened. She took a breath. "He always said if something ever happened to him, we should celebrate his work, not mourn his loss. But Jamal, I'm not ready to celebrate." Neither was he. A candlelight vigil sprang up outside the hospital where Daniel had once interned. Photos of him with patients, laughing, holding babies, comforting mothers, filled the fence line. Jamal stood in the back. He didn't want attention, but when someone passed him the microphone, he didn't refuse it either. "He was a boy when I met him. Skinny, scared, hungry. And still he asked if his sister could eat first." A ripple of emotion moved through the crowd. Daniel gave more than he ever took, and if this world is fair, and I believe some parts of it are, then wherever he is tonight, he is not alone. 3 days passed, then 5, then 7. And then the miracle came. A blurry cell phone video emerged. A relief team uncovered survivors, Daniel among them, bruised, dehydrated, but alive. He was helping carry another man on a stretcher when the camera caught him. Even in his own suffering, he was still saving someone else. The news hit Jamal like thunder and sunlight all at once. He dropped to his knees right there in the living room and wept, not just for the relief, but for the reminder. Some lights don't go out, not when they're lit from something deeper. Daniel returned home 2 weeks later. When he stepped off the plane, cameras flashed. Reporters surged forward. But he didn't look for them. He looked for Jamal. And when he found him, standing quietly near a line of staff, Daniel walked past the microphones, past the lights, and wrapped his arms around the man who once bought him a warm coat and a notebook.
Neither said anything. They didn't need to. The world had its headline, but what Jamal carried in his heart was heavier, deeper, truer than ink could print.
The invitation came in a simple white envelope, delivered by hand. No gold leaf, no embossed logos, just a handwritten name across the front, Mr. Jamal Winters. Inside was a card, elegant in its restraint, with 7 words that made his hands tremble. We request your presence at the Capitol. It was Chloe's idea. She and Daniel had been nominated for a National Humanitarian Award, an honor given to those who embody the spirit of compassion and impact. But when asked who they wanted to present them, both gave the same answer without hesitation. Jamal. He tried to decline at first. "I'm no politician," he told Chloe on the phone. "I've never spoken in a room like that." Chloe said, "You've spoken in kitchens and classrooms. You've spoken through actions, not microphones. That's exactly why you belong there." The night of the ceremony, the town seemed to hold its breath. Shops closed early. The diner's windows glowed softly, a picture of Jamal and the 2 siblings taped to the glass. At the school, students gathered in the auditorium to stream the event. Pastor Ray even canceled Wednesday night service, saying, "Tonight, church is wherever that man stands." Back in Washington, Jamal stood behind the curtain, stiff in a borrowed suit. He clutched the index cards in his coat pocket, but knew he wouldn't use them. The MC's voice rang out, "Please welcome the man whose kindness decades ago sparked a chain of hope that hasn't stopped growing, Mr. Jamal Winters." He stepped into the light. The applause rose, thunderous and unfiltered. Jamal blinked against the brightness, but not from stage lights, but from tears. He took a breath. "I never thought I'd stand here," he began, his voice gravelly but steady. "Not in a room like this, not for something I never saw as extraordinary." He looked down at Chloe and Daniel, seated among senators and philanthropists. "I gave a meal, a ride, a moment of warmth. I didn't know what would come from it. I only knew someone needed help." He paused. The silence was thick. "You call it kindness, but where I come from, we just call that being human." Across the nation, people watched. In a town far away, a little girl in a foster home wiped her eyes. In a shelter kitchen, a young man whispered, "That's what I want to be." In Grace's house, now his home, Jamal's picture flickered on the living room TV as neighbors gathered around, hushed. Later that evening, back in the town that had once overlooked him, Jamal stepped out of the black car and onto his front porch. He looked up. The streetlights flickered with snowfall. And then, one by one, porches across the block lit up. People came out, not to gawk, not to congratulate, but simply to be present. Someone began to hum Amazing Grace. No one spoke, not because there was nothing to say, but because sometimes silence is the loudest kind of honor. That night, the town didn't move. No traffic, no gossip, no noise. Just the soft crunch of fresh snow beneath the weight of a story that had changed them all. The train ride home from Washington was silent, not because there was nothing to say, but because Jamal, Chloe, and Daniel were still carrying the weight of what had just happened. Not the weight of fame or headlines, but something more intimate, more sacred. The weight of lives changed, of truths spoken out loud, and of a promise to continue. When the train pulled into the small town station, the platform was empty. No reporters, no banners, no welcoming committee. Just the wind, the rustling trees, and the familiar smell of soil and pine. Exactly how Jamal liked it. The next morning, he walked back to Grace's house. The old place hadn't changed much.
The creaking steps, the worn rail, the ceramic angel by the mailbox, all still there. But the feeling was different. It wasn't a house he visited now. It was a place that lived in his bones. He opened the front door slowly. Inside, a blanket rested on the arm of the couch. Chloe had folded it there before they left. Daniel's muddy sneakers sat by the back door. The kitchen still smelled faintly of cinnamon and old wood, like Grace's hugs somehow lingered in the grain of the cabinets. He placed the envelope from the Capitol gently on the table. Then he walked into the room at the back, the room Grace once slept in, the room where kindness was born. Later that week, Jamal returned to work, not because he had to, but because purpose isn't something you retire from. He volunteered again at the local shelter. Not everyone recognized him. A few did, but most saw just a tall man with tired hands and a warm voice who knew how to stir soup with grace and clean pots without complaining. One afternoon, a young girl approached him shyly. "You're the man from the screen," she whispered. Jamal smiled. "I've been a lot of things. What made you say that?" "You look like someone who remembers people." He didn't know how to respond, but she was right. Chloe, now working full-time at a nonprofit advocating for food equity, returned one weekend and brought with her a camera crew. Not for Jamal, not for herself, but to document the stories of others who had helped or been helped, those whose lives never made headlines, but were no less heroic. She asked Jamal to tell his story one more time. He agreed, but only on one condition, that the camera starts in the kitchen. That evening, Jamal sat on the back porch with Daniel. No lights, no microphones, just the fading sun and the sound of grasshoppers clicking their evening hymns. "You ever miss the old days?" Daniel asked. Jamal thought for a long time. "I don't miss the hunger, but I miss the moments when small things felt like salvation, when a warm plate or a stranger's smile meant the world." He looked out toward the empty fields beyond the fence line. "I think the world is just made of small salvations strung together." Daniel leaned back in the chair beside him. "I think you're right." That night, Jamal found himself walking through the house again. He paused by the window where Grace used to stand, praying for whoever was out there, stranger or saint, it didn't matter. He looked out now and whispered a quiet prayer of his own, not for anything new, but simply in gratitude. The town no longer ignored him, but more importantly, it listened differently now to its poor, its elderly, its overlooked. People had started checking on neighbors. Donations at the shelter had tripled. The high school was building a scholarship fund named in Grace's memory. And all of it began with one tired waitress feeding 2 orphans. Jamal sat down at Grace's old desk and pulled open the drawer. Inside, beneath a few old napkins and recipes, was a letter. For the day they come back. It was her handwriting. He unfolded it carefully. Inside it read, "If ever love knocks again, don't be afraid to open the door, even if the world has taught you to lock it, especially then." Jamal leaned back, closed his eyes, and let the stillness wrap around him. He had returned to Grace, and Grace had never really left.
They didn't name the scholarship fund after Jamal. They named it after Grace. The Grace Walton Foundation for First Chances. Because everyone in town agreed. Second chances were for those who had the luxury to fail once and try again. But what Grace had given all those years ago to 2 hungry children standing in the rain wasn't a second chance. It was their first. Their first meal without shame. Their first moment of being seen. Their first glimpse of hope. The ceremony was held on the steps of the very diner where it all began. Now renovated, freshly painted in soft cream and red trim, the building no longer bore the rusted sadness it once did.
The booth where Jamal and Daniel first sat was preserved with a small plaque that simply read, "She fed more than their hunger." Jamal didn't speak long that day. He stood before a crowd of neighbors, students, strangers and friends, some who knew the story well and some who had only just learned it. And he said, "Kindness doesn't make headlines, until it does. But even then, that's not where its power lives. Kindness is what you do when no one's watching. It's the legacy you leave in someone else's hands." He paused, glancing toward the sky. She didn't feed us for glory. She fed us because we were hungry, and she loved us until we could love ourselves. After the ceremony, Chloe helped carry boxes of books and photo albums to the new Grace Walton Community Center, funded entirely by donations from across the country. Inside were shelves of food, a study room with free tutoring, a hot meal program for single mothers, and a tiny studio where kids could record stories of the people who changed their lives. The first story they recorded? Jamal's. Daniel later took a job as a pilot for a humanitarian flight organization, flying food, vaccines, and emergency aid to hard-to-reach places. Once, he landed a helicopter in a remote village and handed out biscuits to children who reminded him of himself and Jamal. Just smaller, hungrier, and a little lost. He left behind more than food that day. He left behind the story of a woman named Grace, who once fed him without asking for anything in return. Years passed. Grace's house, now home to rotating volunteers, remained a place of peace. There was always something baking in the oven, always a chair open at the table, always someone listening by the window. And each year, on the same day, Jamal returned to the porch. He'd sit in the rocking chair, fold his hands, and watch the sun dip low over the hills. He didn't cry anymore when he sat there. Not because he stopped missing her, but because he knew she had never really left. She lived in every kind gesture, every warm plate, every hand extended without expectation. The world had changed since that rainy night 18 years ago. But the core of it hadn't. Not where it counted. And as long as there were people willing to notice the hungry, willing to share what little they had, willing to remember the power of a simple act, Grace would never be gone. Because legacies aren't written in stone. They're written in kindness. And hers was carved into hearts around the world.